Okay, the Sparkling Mikado review. I thought it would be worthwhile to make this video to talk about the things I've discovered in the Stanford Daily, Halloween 1969. Page 4 contains this review, Gilbert and Sullivan's Sparkling Show. First thing that I noticed about this review was that it was written by an aficionado of the show, like someone who's really into Gilbert and Sullivan and into the Mikado. And the reason that you can know that is the language in the article. It talks about typical Gilbert and Sullivan complications, the inevitable happy ending, references the famous song, Let the Punishment Fit the Crime, and the author notes that the Mikado gives a truly diabolical laugh. Here we see it says, I was pleased to hear the words in all the songs, something even D'Orly Carte Company doesn't seem to be able, I'm assuming it says able to do. D'Orly Carte was the troupe that performed Gilbert and Sullivan from the 1880s right up until around the 1980s. This is someone who went to see one. And I believe it sort of implies went to see a few. This is a person who really knows about the Mikado, really knows about Gilbert and Sullivan. And I just keep saying this person because there is no byline. Now, having no byline is not the biggest deal. There are plenty of reviews in the Stanford Daily that are uncredited. Nevertheless, we don't know who wrote this article, but we do know that they really liked the Mikado. The next thing I would note about this article is that just bad layout. In fact, really some of the worst layout, if not the worst layout of any Stanford Daily article I could find. Just right off the bat, you note that look how close it is here to this other article. Very close here, and in the middle, just much too wide. It was so far over to the left that a bunch of these letters here are cut off. I'll take this off here so you can see that all along here, all of these words are cut off. Then you have these spots on here. I don't know what would actually cause that. Originally, I thought that maybe these pieces of text weren't glued down on the paper well enough and perhaps they bubbled up. And then when the board was sent out to be photographed, to be engraved for the printing plates, perhaps there was a glare. That was my original thinking. But nonetheless, this entire layout section, up even to here, this is all really bad layout. I thought it was sort of strange. I decided to look at the rest of the paper and this other Record Review article. Capitol had just put out a bunch of old masters, so to speak, out on vinyl. Before they talk about the old masters, though, there is a review for an album called The Electric Zodiac. Now, The Electric Zodiac was put out by a guy named Douglas Leedy. I actually bought one of these off of eBay and listened to it. It is very experimental. You might describe it as somewhat more melodic than a power saw, but I thought that was kind of a coincidence that there would be a review for an album called Electric Zodiac on the same page as a review for the Mikado. And I went over here and I saw that the photo for this review is indeed for Douglas Leedy's Electric Zodiac. And I looked at the picture, and this is pretty much the first time that I really wondered if I was onto something. The word electric is missing. For a while, I really was kind of creeped out by this. But I went back to the internet, and when I saw the cover of the Electric Zodiac, I cracked up, because the word electric is in cyan. Now, print people know that cyan in a newspaper layout doesn't print. The grid paper you lay it out on is in cyan, and anything that is in that color doesn't print. So if you're going to run an album cover with cyan on it, you would photograph it in black and white first, and then run the black and white photo, in which case the word electric would still be visible. Either the person who prepared this photo was a real novice and didn't know what was going to happen, or they were a real professional, and they chuckled about the fact that the word electric would disappear. The number of coincidences were starting to mount up on this. I wanted to go back in and investigate the spots some more. I looked around in the Daily, and I noted that on page 3, on the other side of the paper, it also had spots, 2 spots, and I actually discovered that it had 3 spots. I thought for sure that it looked like that they went through the paper, and I absolutely did confirm that, flipping page 3, and I put page 3 here in green, page 4, of course, in black. but it's on the other side of the paper. So of course you have to mirror it. And when you do, you see that yes, indeed, those spots line up perfectly. In regards to this third spot up here, I hadn't seen it on page 4 before, but now it became clear that there were 3 spots that were on both sides of the paper. So immediately I jumped to the conclusion someone must have poured solvent on these pages and that it bled through to page 3. And if that were the case, that would mean that someone went in, most likely to the bound volume of the Stanford Daily, and had done this bit of sabotage. And that matched up very well with what I had already discovered, which was someone went into the Stanford Chaparral archives and made a fake issue and planted that in our archives. So this seemed like a second instance of someone modifying the archives. So with these spots bleeding through to page 3, and under the assumption that this was a solvent that had been poured on the paper, my next thought was, I wonder if it went through to page 2. I went and found page 2, and I noted that there were no spots, but the main spot was exactly over this letter to the editor about the Zodiac Killer. What an amazing coincidence that the main spot on this Mikado review happens to just land pretty much entirely. I mean, it's not on any other article, pretty much entirely on this very short letter to the editor about the Zodiac. And again, when I read the letter, your message to the Zodiac Killer was a stupid and tasteless statement. I wondered, oh my God, what did they do at the Stanford Daily? More on that later. Anyway, that is how these spots land. I thought that was pretty much an amazing coincidence. Well, I decided to really look at the Stanford Daily, meaning every day around this issue. I started by working backwards. I looked at every issue from October 31st through the beginning of the quarter. There were no other spots like this. I thought I'd found something really unique. I started going the other direction, and to my initial disappointment, I found the spots again on November 5th. Then again on November 7th. Somewhat lighter, but they're absolutely there. November 19th, November 24th, November 26th, December 3rd, and December 5th. 8 total sets of the 3-spot pattern in all. The December 5th issue was the last issue of the Daily that quarter, stopping for winter break. I looked at the entire month of January, the next quarter, and did not find any of these spots. What's more, 7 of the 8 occur on pages 3 and 4, but the last, December 5th, occurs on pages 5 and 6. What on earth is going on here? So a family friend of mine back from my hometown in Indiana worked in newspapers, and in fact worked in newspapers from about 1970 on, including being on press. I showed all this to him and he said, oh, that's absolutely on press. That is a crushed print blanket. He explained that it was a rubber transfer element. It's basically on a Gauss printer. It would be on a big tube. It's possible that if something's misfed, a lot of times a paper jam, and then it causes the blanket to be crushed. The reason why these blemishes appear on both sides of the paper is that both sides of the paper are printed at the same time. And if there was a crushed blanket on one of the 2 print blankets, it would show up as a blemish on both sides of the paper. He also explained that he said the one day that it was on page 5 and 6 and not 3 and 4, he postulated that that last issue might have a lot more pages. And in fact, I did see that the December 5 issue had 14 pages, the largest issue of the quarter, and his instincts seemed to be pretty spot on, no pun intended. So I was not faced with anyone pouring solvent on these pages. But the one thing that was amazing, still to me, these spots begin on that October 31st issue. And the first time they're ever seen is on the Mikado review. Is that a coincidence? By the way, I asked my friend, could someone make a mark on the print blanket exactly on a certain article? And he goes, oh yeah, that would be a piece of cake. There's actually ink on this print blanket, but it's mirrored. He said pressmen, it was a matter of course that they could read things backwards, and even today it's a basic skill of a newspaper pressman. As far as how you would damage a print blanket, he said you could just use your hand, probably more like a small hammer, and you could ding right on the article you wanted to mark. It seemed to me the shape of this spot was also sort of a coincidence. It's sort of shaped like a West Virginia without the stovepipe, but this part that extends up here to the upper right, if it was just one line higher, well, it would be exactly over the words the Zodiac. But it's not. But even so, I thought that was kind of an interesting little extra. So I've been showing these graphics with this purple outline representing where the spot goes. I just sort of roughed it in, but basically stuck to where the spot, as I called it, would only go to white, and I did not include the sort of partial areas. But when I realized that this was a print blemish, and then seeing how it varied across the different printings we had, I realized that this blemish actually included all these partial areas. And so I redrew this graphic outline to include the affected areas, even if it was just partially. I wondered if the modified shape would affect where it landed on the words the Zodiac, and it did now come to encompassing about half of the word. I still wondered if this alignment was something significant, so I began to think about the practical aspects of how this could be done. Meaning, how would I mark page 4 in such a way that it landed in a perfect spot on page 2? Well, I would measure. I would measure from a corner here. So I measured from this upper right corner down to the spot, and it's between 16.5 and 17 inches away. Now, this would be on a curved cylinder, and there would be wet ink. I realized that it would be a lot simpler, a lot more sense to measure from this lower right corner, because that was only somewhat less than 7 inches to get to the spot. And then I'm going to go over here on page 4 and put the mark in exactly that spot. And I'm going to measure here from the lower right. Well, when I looked here, I noted that the lower right, the corners don't match. So I'm going to go back up here. I'm going to double check. Yes, the top matches pretty well, but the lower right doesn't match at all. And that's when the light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, I wonder, let's align the lower right corner of page 2, where you would measure from, to get my distance on page 4 to make the mark. And let's see what happens. I don't know about you, but I call that one F of a coincidence. Several F's of a coincidence, actually. The question becomes, how many coincidences do you need stacked upon one another before you come to the conclusion that it wasn't coincidence, it was intentional? Because this is October 1969, the public won't know that the Zodiac has a thing for the Mikado for another year. The only person who would know to connect these things would be the perpetrator. If someone intentionally marked the October 31st Stanford Daily on the Mikado Review, then 1, this person is the Zodiac, and 2, the Zodiac is a newspaperman. That's where I'm going to leave this one for now. There's more, but we'll leave that for another video and another installment in the near future. Thank you.